It's the first week of September as I'm releasing this video. Summer is almost over. Fall is on the way. Labor Day has just come and gone. Our specifically non-socialist American version of Labor Day. We give our workers a respectful nod and then shove them back into the factories. That's all you blue-collar schmoes get, and you should be glad for it. What are we, a bunch of commies? Anyway, for kids and teenagers across the land, September means something else. Back to school. Most schools started already in August, but let's not get tangled up in the details, okay? Because you know who else went back to school? MacGyver. In fact, there were a couple of episodes of the classic MacGyver series that featured our feather-haired hero getting caught up in campus-centered misadventures of one kind or another. The episode I'm going to talk about in this video is from Season 5. It's the 13th episode of that season. It's titled Live and Learn, and the can't-miss premise is this: MacGyver becomes a high school teacher. We open with an establishing shot of students rushing in to attend class at the Lord Strathcona School. Yep, just a typical public school in Los Angeles, California, in the good old US of A. Hey, look who the science teacher is! It's MacGyver! Well, he's not the teacher so much as the guest speaker, I suppose. And he's doing some Mr. Wizard shit, demonstrating a principle of physics by balancing two forks on the rim of a glass using a matchstick. The kids don't seem too into it, so MacGyver picks on the most talkative one, this guy, Darren, a football player who's like, I'm an athlete. When am I ever going to need knowledge of physics? MacGyver demonstrates the advantages of having a low center of gravity by bringing the much larger Darren up to the front of the classroom for an impromptu football drill and flipping him over on his back. Everybody laughs, but MacGyver helps Darren up, reassures him that many important scientific discoveries have been made by running football plays in classrooms, and just to make sure there are no hard feelings, he offers Darren a role as a regular in a future series. By the way, not only is that Christopher Judge, who would go on to co-star with Richard Dean Anderson in Stargate SG-1, if I'm not mistaken, this is his first credited acting role. So, there's a little nugget of trivia for all you Stargate fans, whatever you call yourselves. Master Gators, I have no idea. MacGyver also reminds Darren and the rest of the class of the importance and usefulness of simple machines, like the lever, for instance. Remember, kids, in case this comes up later for some reason, MacGyver says, the lever. Class ends, the students are filing out, and the regular teacher, this ineffectual dweeb here, walks up to MacGyver like, wow, you really seem to get these hopeless dead-enders interested in science there for a second. But then this student walks up, Tony, who we noticed didn't seem too enthralled by MacGyver's fork and football forward presentation. Tony says to MacGyver, yeah, well, I thought it sucked, and leaves. The dweeby teacher says to MacGyver, what a shame. Tony's bright, but he's well on his way to becoming one of the 700,000 students who drop out of school every year in this country. And by this country, you mean the United States? Of course! What other country could I mean but the United States, the country where we currently are? Meanwhile, in the hallway, we see Pete running into the principal of the school, Mrs. Juarez. They take turns delivering some exposition that lets us know MacGyver is here as part of a Phoenix Foundation pilot program designed to reduce the dropout rate. God, is there anything the Phoenix Foundation doesn't do? Throughout the run of the series, we see Phoenix involving itself in international relations, environmental projects, law enforcement, scientific research, social welfare programs, here education. MacGyver doesn't just carry a Swiss Army knife, he works for one. If I'd been a writer for this series, I would have made it my personal challenge to get as many out-of-left-field Phoenix Foundation projects into the show as I possibly could. The Phoenix Foundation Board Game Development Division, the Phoenix Foundation School of Erotic Photography, the Phoenix Foundation Upholstery Shop, the Phoenix Foundation Orbital Research Platform. Can you believe we never got MacGyver in space? Uncharacteristically, I have wandered off topic. Pete meets up with MacGyver and the dweeb science teacher, and they head over to a room where some students are working on projects for the upcoming science fair. This kid's entry apparently has something to do with high voltage. I'm not sure what specific scientific concept it's supposed to be demonstrating, but if that's a real miniature Frankenstein, he's got to win first prize, right? Well, maybe not. Tony arrives with a remote control, pushes a button, and Mini Frankenstein blows up. Tony drops his remote control and makes a run for it, with the furious creator of the now dead, re-dead, I guess, Mini Frankenstein, charging after him. MacGyver picks up Tony's remote and gives chase as well. He catches up to Tony and the other kid, who are brawling on the hallway floor. They get separated. MacGyver and Pete and Mrs. Juarez are joined by this guy, Mr. Fraley. He's another teacher at the school, and he's played by James Sloyan, so he's instantly my favorite character. Mr. Fraley has had it with these punk kids. He tells MacGyver and Pete what he thinks of their fancy Dan Phoenix Foundation and suggests they give up on losers like Tony here, who have checked out, and focus on the kids who still care about their education. Then a cop shows up and cuffs Tony and drags him away. Pete's like, armed security guards in public schools? What kind of dystopian nightmare is this? Cut to the construction site where Tony's dad works. He's not happy about getting called into school to deal with his juvenile delinquent son. While we're here, we dip into the construction office, where we catch the foreman and the developer discussing the fraud they're about to commit to save money on the building project. Then we catch up with Tony's dad, Nick, as he arrives at the school to jerk a knot in that good-for-nothing boy of his. He says to Tony, "How many times do I have to tell you? If you don't want to be in school, quit and get yourself a good job. A good job that doesn't require a high school diploma." Pete gives a little presentation to some of the teachers at the school. The big idea to reduce the dropout rate? Identify potential dropouts before it's too late and assign them mentors. It's foolproof as far as I can see. However, Mr. Fraley is not impressed. He thinks this is all a lot of feel-good horseshit that won't do any good for anyone. They've selected a test case for the new mentor program, and it's Tony, of course. And his two mentors will be MacGyver and Mr. Fraley. Fraley's like, "I have to be a teacher and a mentor? I didn't sign up for this shit." MacGyver and Fraley drive over to Tony's house in MacGyver's two-tone vintage pickup. Does Tony have a remote control that can blow that fucking thing up? I hope. They talk to Nick. MacGyver's like, "Good news," and he hands Nick a paper. Nick glances at the paper like, "Yeah? So? Am I supposed to be impressed? I never seen a piece of paper before?" MacGyver's like, "We thought you'd be glad to see what's on the paper. Looks like letters. Big deal. Letters which spell out that your son Tony is no longer suspended." Psh, no kidding. I could have told you that from what it says on this paper. Nick thinks Tony would be better off dropping out and getting a job, but he begrudgingly steps aside to allow his obviously long-suffering wife to show MacGyver and Fraley down to the basement, where Tony is working on something, hopefully that truck-exploding remote control we talked about earlier. Come on, Tony, I'll pay you. It's 1990 where you are. How's $20 sound? That's like $50 in 2025 money. And $10,000 in 2027 money. Fraley tells Tony that his suspension has been lifted, but Tony shrugs it off, saying he's not coming back to school, he's going to work. MacGyver is impressed by Tony's interest in electrical engineering and urges him to come to science class tomorrow. Outside, MacGyver and Fraley make a bet. If Tony no-shows tomorrow, Fraley can quit being a mentor and just go back to being a bitter and disillusioned public school teacher like God intended. But if Tony comes to class, then Fraley has to take over the entire mentor program and run it after MacGyver leaves. Cut to Tony arriving for class the next day. Fraley's like, "You little bastard, I'll see to it that you pay for this." Now, actually, he seems kind of happy, but he's trying to no-sell it so as to not spoil his rep as an emotionally unreachable cynic. MacGyver sets up an experiment in the science class. He's got 2 glass tanks full of dirt and a gadget called a densometer, which is made to, get this, measure the density of soil. With help from Tony, who is now the star student because he showed up for class one day after getting suspended, MacGyver demonstrates the densometer and shows that even though the 2 tanks of soil appear to be the same, one is actually denser than the other. Why might this information be important? To find out how much punishment a football field can take, says Darren, whose one personality trait is plays football. That is the incorrect answer. So you know how far down piling should go when you put up a building, says Tony. This is the correct answer, which Tony knows because his father is in the construction business, which is cheating. No points for Tony. Tony comes home from school later that day, obviously in a good mood from becoming the star of science class, probably only carrying a small amount of regret over not blowing up those tanks of soil with remote control. But his good mood comes to an end when he runs into his dad, who has great news. A guy at the job site got hurt. And that great news comes with more related great news. Nick got the boss to hire Tony as the hurt guy's replacement. Now Tony can really quit school. So that's what he does. Later, Pete arrives at the school office and says to MacGyver, "I just got a call from Washington. Next week, there's someone coming to observe our mentor program from the Department of Education." Hey, how about that? When this episode was made, there was still a Department of Education. In comes Mr. Fraley to throw some cold water on that, though. There won't be anything for the observer to observe. I just talked to Mrs. Juarez, and Tony has officially, totally, and for reals dropped out of school. And the music swells and we fade to black on this incredibly dramatic beat, and can't they just pick another kid to mentor? Like, I know we're supposed to care about Tony and all, but if the concern is the future of the mentor program, just pick another teenage fuck-up with potential to mentor. Hey, problem solved. Pay me, Pete. Over at the construction site, work is progressing, but trouble is on the horizon. Nick, Tony's dad, notices the concrete they're pouring seems unusually thin. The foreman tells him not to worry about it, then notices a building inspector snooping around. Those guys are always trouble. Can't a businessman cut corners to save a few bucks at the expense of public safety without the government breathing down his neck? I mean, now he probably can. MacGyver shows up looking for Tony. He tries to lure him back to school with scholarship pamphlets, but Nick interrupts like, "Hey, MacGyver, can't you read what the sign says?" "I can. It says, 'No advocating for education on these premises. MacGyver, this means you.'" MacGyver leaves, but Tony seems interested in the scholarships MacGyver told him about. Tony heads into the construction office to take out the trash and witnesses the foreman paying off the building inspector to overlook the code violations he found. The inspector takes the bribe and crumples up his original inspection form and tosses it in the garbage. When the foreman and the inspector fuck off to get some celebratory post-bribe coffee, Tony sneaks into the office and grabs the inspection form out of the trash can. He takes the form to his dad, who snatches the form away, scolds Tony for sticking his nose in things that aren't his business, and sends him back to work. The foreman sees Nick yelling at Tony and walks up to see what's the matter. Nick hands over the form and says, "My kid was taking out the trash and he found this. He thought it might be important, but I knew it wasn't. I didn't even bother to read it, which I could have if I'd wanted to. I just didn't want to." Tony watches from a distance as the foreman lights the inspection form on fire and tosses it into a bucket. That night at the school, Fraley and MacGyver are both working late. MacGyver smarts off to Fraley about how he's part of the broken educational system, and Fraley unloads, telling MacGyver that when he started teaching, he was full of energy and hope, and he thought he had everything figured out. And then he ran into the reality of public education: overcrowded schools, poverty, too much work, too little money, and institutional support. In other words, like all cynics, or so TV and movies would have us believe, Mr. Fraley is a disappointed idealist. MacGyver tries to tell Fraley that it's not too late, that he can still make a positive difference in the lives of his students. The first step is finding the will to care again. MacGyver and Fraley cross paths with Tony, who is running from the school cop. Tony says that he snuck into the school to borrow the densometer MacGyver demonstrated in class because he wants to use it at the construction site to gather evidence of the code violations the building inspector was bribed to overlook. Tony explains to MacGyver and Fraley what happened earlier: the foreman and the inspector, the inspection form being burned, and MacGyver agrees to go back to the job site with Tony. By stretching their combined intellectual faculties to the limit, MacGyver and Tony are somehow able to outwit the night watchman at the construction site.
"Skip, is that you?"
What are you doing here?
"I lost my wallet."
And make off with the bucket containing the charred remains of the inspection form. They head back to the school, where MacGyver treats the burned form with a solution of glycerol to soften it and get it to uncurl, then photographs it with some infrared film and develops the photo in the darkroom so they can read what it says. Isn't science neat? Too bad we don't fund it anymore. Ah well, we had a good run. Now that they have a copy of the incriminating inspection form, MacGyver suggests that Tony show it to his dad. Tony doesn't see the point. I showed my dad that form already and he didn't care, Tony says. My dad must be in on this scam. MacGyver says, Tony, I want you to brace yourself for a shock here, okay? I don't think your dad knows how to read. That's ridiculous, MacGyver. Of course my dad knows how to read. He reads the articles in Playboy magazine every single month. Sometimes I catch him reading the articles from old issues over again. He loves reading them so much. Brushing Tony's skepticism at his father's obvious illiteracy aside for the moment, they head to the construction site. By the time they arrive, there's been an accident. Some of that substandard concrete they were pouring has buckled, a ceiling has caved in, and Tony's father is trapped under some rubble. The concrete slab on top of Nick is too heavy to lift by hand. Does anybody know a simple machine that could help in this situation? Anybody? MacGyver improvises a lever. The answer is lever. Remember that one from earlier? Anyway, MacGyver improvises a lever using a steel beam from the construction site, and Tony and the rest of the crew use it to lift the concrete slab up off of Nick. MacGyver slides some of the rubble aside. Fortunately, the dangerously diluted concrete is extremely lightweight and easy to move, and he drags Nick to safety. Then MacGyver whips out the photograph of the inspection form and busts the developer and the foreman right there in front of everybody. Your chickens are coming home to roost, you crooks. Remember when that used to happen every now and then? Moved by his son's devotion, Nick says to Tony, Son, there's something I need to tell you. I wasn't reading the articles. Tony's like, I know, Pop. I know. MacGyver's standing there like, oh, that's sweet. We get a quick epilogue where Tony tells MacGyver, Pete, and Mr. Fraley that his dad is getting out of the hospital and he's decided to take night classes to learn to read. Fraley says, will your dad need a tutor to help him get started? MacGyver's like, you got anyone in mind? And Fraley says, yeah, someone who's discovering his love of education again for no adequately explored reason. Smile, 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 freeze frame, the end! I guess if you come to MacGyver to see him escape a death trap by pulling out his Swiss Army knife and improvising an air cannon powerful enough to blow a door off its hinges using only an old t-shirt, a half-empty bottle of motor oil, and a can of tennis balls, this might not be your favorite episode. There are a few bits to remind us that MacGyver knows science, including plot-relevant stuff like using the glycerol and infrared film to read the burned inspection form and devising a lever to save Nick, but it's not the most MacGyver-y episode in terms of watching our guy invent his way out of trouble. The thing is, I don't mind that, because this isn't a Swiss Army knife episode, this is a social issue episode. In fact, it's a twofer. It's a high school dropout episode and an illiteracy episode. I love MacGyver's social issue episodes. The first video in this series is about one, the anti-gun episode. You know what I think I love the most about MacGyver's social issue episodes? The fact that they exist. Sure, they can be heavy-handed and simplistic. Sure, they can be corny. Sure, some of them make the preachiest Twilight Zone script Rod Serling ever spoken to a dictaphone seem understated by comparison, but at least they tried to say something relevant. At least they represented an attempt by the creators of the show to use their weekly network TV platform to tell stories that were about more than just an ingenious guy with what at the time was considered great hair running through the standard action-adventure show paces. And at least they served to remind us of what kind of a guy our hero is. MacGyver himself is an open-minded, optimistic, unabashed liberal. He is anti-gun, pro-science, pro-education, he is an environmentalist, and he believes people shouldn't be judged by where they're from, what they look like, or what they can or can't do. Sure, sometimes his liberalism comes across as naive or unintentionally condescending, but in its best moments, the show seems aware of this and puts it to use. This episode, Live and Learn, has such a moment when Fraley goes off on MacGyver that night they're both working late at the school. MacGyver's well-meaning push to encourage the jaded Fraley to start giving a damn about his work again is what precipitates Fraley's explosion. MacGyver describes Tony as a kid who's been failed by the system, then adds, in a slightly accusatory tone, "You know, you're a part of that system, Fraley." And Fraley lets MacGyver have it, and rightfully so.
I have one drawer and a desk that I have to share with 2 other teachers. No homeroom of my own. 45 kids in a class. 45 kids in a class. Not enough textbooks to go around.
My man acted the shit out of that one, didn't he? It's not that MacGyver's trying to be a patronizing asshole, but it does seem like he hasn't taken into account Fraley's experience in this overloaded, under-supported education system, and how that experience has brought Fraley to the place he is today. It's not that Fraley's a bad guy. He's not a sadist, and he's not completely uncaring. He's just calloused over and exhausted and reluctant to believe that things can get better because from his perspective, they never have. It's a great moment for Fraley and for James Sloyan as Fraley, raw, passionate, and still sadly ringing true today, 35 years after this episode was originally broadcast. But it's also a reminder of MacGyver's own privileged position relative to the broken system Fraley is a part of, and the limitations inherent to that position, and that reminder is delivered with a subtlety that is not present in most of the rest of the episode. Just because he's a little dismissive of Fraley's experience for much of this episode, that doesn't mean MacGyver isn't still a role model. When this show does social issue episodes, MacGyver is usually the one who's teaching the lesson, not the one who has to learn the lesson, and Live and Learn is no exception. In addition to his idealistic commitment to education and science, MacGyver also shows us that he doesn't look down on Nick for not being able to read. He feels empathy for Nick, for the embarrassment that has compelled Nick to hide his illiteracy, and he wants to help. MacGyver also makes it clear to Tony that he finds nothing shameful in blue-collar work. The scene where MacGyver finds Tony at the construction site after Tony drops out could very easily have gone down a different, more elitist road if it wasn't so carefully written. MacGyver is against Tony dropping out and becoming a construction worker because he knows it's not what Tony actually wants, not because he looks down on construction as a career.
What if I ain't interested?
Then that's your choice. If this is really what you want for yourself, great. That's no crime. But if it isn't, if you wake up 30 years from now and all you are is 30 years older, that is a crime.
There's a version of that scene where MacGyver is all like, "What are you doing here, Tony? You're better than this. You don't have to pour concrete for a living. You've got a brain." That version is not in the episode because the script, written by Rick Middleman, is better than that. Which is not to say the script is perfect. This is MacGyver after all, and if it was perfect, I probably wouldn't love it as much as I do. Both Tony and Fraley undergo some fairly significant character changes, and these changes occur abruptly and mostly off-screen. We meet Tony as a sullen ne'er-do-well who makes sure to pause on his way out of class to tell MacGyver he sucks, then he triggers an explosion among the science fair projects, gets into a brawl in the hallway, and is literally dragged from the school in handcuffs. But after MacGyver and Fraley visit him at home, and MacGyver asks him to come back to class, Tony returns to school a completely changed person. He's helpful, he participates in class, he runs home that afternoon excited to tell his parents that he's been readmitted to school. He transforms overnight into a real apple polisher. For MacGyver, anyway, not for his actual science teacher, the dweeb in the sweater, who receives no respect, nor does he deserve it. Nice sweater. Was Fred Rogers having a yard sale? You're not man enough to rock a Fred Rogers sweater. We might, I suppose, attribute Tony's attitude adjustment to the fact that MacGyver and Fraley seek him out, and MacGyver, in particular, believes in Tony and encourages him to pursue his interests. All Tony needed was a role model to give him some positive attention. I mean, maybe. It's still a pretty sudden shift. So is the shift Fraley goes through between when MacGyver and Tony leave him at the school to go retrieve the burned inspection form from the construction site, and the next time we see him in the epilogue. After Fraley reads him for filth over saying, "You're part of that system, Fraley," MacGyver seems to get through to him a little bit, asking him to try and get back in touch with that younger, more idealistic version of himself. When MacGyver and Fraley catch Tony running from the school cop, Fraley backs the cop off and gives Tony a chance to explain, which is more understanding than he showed when Tony was handcuffed earlier in the episode. That's an indication that Fraley is starting to change, but then he disappears for the rest of the episode. When he reemerges for the epilogue, he's already completed his transformation from hardened misanthrope to born-again optimist. It breaks one of the cardinal rules of storytelling. It tells us that Fraley has changed, instead of showing us Fraley as he changes. And, it's not a huge deal. The series is called MacGyver, not Mr. Fraley. He's a supporting character. The episode's not even about him. But it's still a clumsy bit of narrative abbreviation. Fraley's character arc is cut off midway through and left as little more than an afterthought, a loose end to be hastily tied off seconds before that closing freeze frame. Still, overall, a fine example of a MacGyver social issue episode. It has its clunky moments, like when dweeby science teacher regurgitates dropout statistics to MacGyver, and I think that structural collapse at the construction site was due just as much to the weight of the leaden plotting as to the cheap concrete. But in the end, it's a network action-adventure series coming out strongly in favor of science, literacy, and education, and that counts for something. It feels like it counts for even more now than it did back then.
How'd you learn to do all this stuff?
How do you think?
The only question I have left at the end of this episode is probably the same one you all have. What became of Mini Frankenstein? Did his creator just give up the experiment after Tony somehow sabotaged it with his remote control of death? Or did this teenage modern Prometheus return to the laboratory, repair the damage done, and bring his Lilliputian abomination back to life to desecrate God's holy creation once more? And if so, did he win first prize at that science fair? What could possibly have beaten out Mini Frankenstein? Did one of those other kids invent a tiny time machine so they can send the class pet into the future and show the Morlocks what a guinea pig looks like? How is that better than Mini Frankenstein? I demand a recount!